Welcome to the Spaceship Earth mission log. Today I have a special episode where we're going to do things a little bit differently. I have Veronica Anderson, who is a member of the Design Science Synarchy Mission, and what we're going to do is something that we've been doing in the space camp this last round that I really enjoy, which is, I think, very important, which is to open with a little bit of a centering before we begin. So I would invite you, Veronica, to lead us in a short opening meditation.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you, dear listeners. We're just going to drop more deeply into a sense of presence and connection. So if you'd like to meet me at the bottom of your next exhalation, we'll breathe in together. Breathing in. Just let it go. Let's do another one like that. Breathing in together. And breathing out. On this third breath together, we'll breathe in. Maybe the deepest breath you've taken all day. And let it out with a sigh or a sound. The breath is a bridge back to the body. So I invite you to connect with your body. You can let your eyes close for a moment if that feels helpful, or gently rest your gaze. Feeling points of contact with anything that you might be sitting on, lying on, or walking upon. Feeling the embrace of gravity as this gentle pull towards the earth. And noticing if you can hear or see any signs that nature is with us. Allowing yourself to be resourced by this abundance of nature in and all around. Thank you for your practice of presence. Thank you, Stephen, for opening this space with me. I can feel the hearts of all our listeners woven together around the earth right now, across time and space, joined in this mission to bring more love and peace and beauty to the world.
Thank you. All right. Wow. I think that's so powerful to open with just an acknowledgement of everyone who's listening and everything that's holding us, the planet that's holding us, and the air that we're breathing, and to connect more deeply. And I feel like that very well connects to the idea of the synarchy. Are you able to share a little bit about your notion of synarchy, like your understanding of how we can group differently and lead differently?
Well, synarchy is a form of rule where we're all self-governing ourselves. So it's a decentralized notion of a group having a sense of direction and order that is sourced from within each individual simultaneously. So in the world, we're really used to seeing someone or a group that represents a one power existing over the rest of the group. There's a hierarchy. And with synarchy, we're saying there's a synthesis of energies, that is, we are co-ruling. And there's an element of sovereignty, of each individual having a sense of what is good and right and true, and honoring that in themselves, and then externalizing it through successful communication and collaboration to co-create directions forward. That's my brief introduction.
Beautifully said. And I think that's something that people want to aspire to, is this non-centralized, non-hierarchical, egalitarian form of leadership. But the trickiest part about that is that to lead well, first you have to lead from within. And so that's where the healing work comes in. That's where the work in nonviolent communication comes in. That's where it helps to be trauma informed when you're dealing with a group of people, especially when we're all leading from examples that we had that maybe were less than ideal, or frameworks that we're trying to make something new. We know what we don't want, but the examples we have for what we are doing are flawed. And so I want to get into your mission as well, but I do want to talk about that internal process, and then also go into your background. You're an architect by training, and you have utilized that in a number of wonderful ways. Could you give me just a brief, 5-minute background into your journey and how that led you ultimately to the Design Science Studio, and also the work you're doing now with your coaching? Tell me just like a kind of a brief bit of, how you ended up where you are now.
I'd love to. Thanks for that invitation. I think storytelling is a really helpful way to bring people deeply into an experience of creating a new future. Where have we been? Where are we going? And so I grew up in Connecticut on the lands of the Nahantic Indian tribe, on the shore of the Atlantic Ocean. And I was always deeply immersed in nature, felt really connected to it in my own way. And it wasn't until I was in architecture school when I realized that people didn't all have that connection to nature. I sort of took it for granted. And I remember learning about sustainability. This was before 2015, when the United Nations 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals were written. There was still an active debate about, is climate change a real thing?
Hmm.
And so I was studying sustainability in architecture school, and they're teaching us that this was an alternative to development practices. And I thought, that's crazy. Why would we do anything that's not sustainable? How could we perpetuate something that we know to be unsustainable and detrimental? And at the time, Occupy Wall Street was a really big deal. The Arab Spring, there was this whole zeitgeist around, wait a minute, the status quo is not serving us. And so I came up as an architect in this idea of, we got to do something. Things need to change. And it really felt like it was on my shoulders as a 18-year-old walking into the profession. And so I ended up going on to get my master's degree in geodesign, which is the use of geospatial technology for sustainable development, specifically to support urban development. Urbanization is the context in which more than 50% of the world lives right now. And our world is only becoming more urbanized. And we actually don't know how to build cities in a way that are truly sustainable.
Yeah.
Right. So I was really motivated to take geospatial data into the architecture profession. I became fascinated by the 2030 Agenda, 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and how we could use data-driven design to actually create places and spaces that were honoring of the nature that they were replacing. Because if we're going to design something, I wanted it to be better than what was there in the first place, which is a little hard to do given that nature has 3.8 billion years of experience designing. And we come in with our, maybe 150 years of industrialization and think we can do it better. But
Stephen Bao
overall,
blew
that
my
was
mind, a mutual friend of ours. And he said something about how, what if we could, and this may not have been an original thought, maybe it was, what if humans could become like with the coral are a living organism. They grow and then they leave their shells and their frameworks and their scaffolding. What if the built environment was like that for nature? We were building something that was harmonizing and creating a framework for life with our
Mhm.
cities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always thought of architecture as a healing art, a way that we can start to interface with the natural environment and co-create with nature. So I do love that expression, and I find Stephen's wisdom to be quite unique, and medicinal in this world.
Mm.
So. Um, I ended up creating something called Home Dash, which is a dashboard for visualizing the heartbeat of Mother Earth. And
Mm.
this was a system based on geospatial data, GIS, and that's Geographic Information Systems. And it had the potential to visualize the way that humans and nature were co-creating or not.
Mm.
And that was a really um, almost spiritual offering for me to put out into the world, because along the way in my architecture journey, I realized that if we were going to create something that was actually new and different, a new way of living with nature, we needed a consciousness shift. And this is something that I didn't invent this idea. We know that if we're going to become a sustainable society, we need a shift in consciousness. But I have a background of 15 years in Zen Buddhism. So I've been studying the power of mindfulness, of the power of presence, for almost half my life. And the reality is, if we're aware and awake, if we're present to what is happening around us, we're automatically motivated into compassionate action. It's just how we are. It's the beauty of being human. So Home Dash was this project that I brought into the Design Science Studio as an incubator, and the which was intended to visualize, where are the problems, where is the armed conflict, where is the poverty, where is there a water shortage, and then where are there opportunities, like where are the biodiversity hotspots, how can we start to create solutions which are targeting our weak spots at a global scale. And this is related to Buckminster Fuller's Geoscope. I actually didn't know about the World Game or Geoscope until I had already brought Home Dash into the Design Science Studio. So the power of that incubator was to really educate me on my ancestors. But I think that's a good introduction to my journey as an architect. There's a lot more I can say about the inner dimension as well, but it's easier often to start with the external architectures.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that most people understand is the externalities, and that's where most people are focused. And so it could be a little murky for some to venture into the inner worlds, and also extremely rewarding. You mentioned Zen and meditation. I think that's a really good place to start. Often in Zen, I love that the teaching isn't overtly teaching, like you are going to learn this and here's what it is and now you've learned it. It's like this puzzle, this riddle that has to be lived, and suddenly you realize, wait, like this doesn't make any sense, and it's like, yeah, that's the point. But in terms of building a better world, you're right, we need to heal not just the planet, but ourselves and our interrelationships and interbeing with one another, because there has been so much trauma in the world, in history, that is even, especially in our modern times where we're, as trauma reperpetuates itself. So a person who is acting out of their trauma will create unintentional or intentional trauma with those they interact with. I mean, just think of a boss that you've had, like, oh, that boss that everybody just walks on eggshells or just comes home tired because of that one guy that's just hard to work with. Well, that person is most likely acting out of their trauma and unaware of it, or simply doesn't care. And those are the things that make it difficult to solve problems together as a group, to collaborate, to really come and bring our whole selves into our work, which I think is essential for humanity now, to anchor into our heart space and really learn to reconnect with ourselves so that we can connect with each other and with nature. And that takes a slowing down, that takes a listening, that takes a tuning in, and that takes an attunement within yourself that the inner work really prepares you for. And so you also do ensoulment coaching. You work with people on sort of a spirit level of being to help them to like clarify, I would say, what it is within them that's trying to emerge, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about that side of your work? And I know that that's going to go more into a lot of your other work with nature and the planet. So please share. Let's explore that.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's often uncomfortable for people to use the word trauma, and you've said it more than I have in this conversation, so I feel right at home. Yeah, I think the word ensoulment is worth sort of chewing on for a minute. And there's this awareness we have that artists and culture creators, they move through their work driven by soul. And you mean, think of a jazz musician. And actually, there's the movie from Disney called Soul, which I think actually represents this concept of ensoulment so well. There's this way that we can move through the world, and I was this way for the majority of my life, where we're just head down, focused on getting the work done. Right? We just want to achieve our goals, meet the requirements, and we're not we're not in our bodies. And I believe that it's from this state that we have created our entire dysfunctional, degenerative society, that we have just been in this this achievement mindset where we're not really here. We're just not fully here. And there was a time in my life where something just snapped, and I came out of denial about all of my own trauma. And these memories of my abusive childhood came up, and they just kept coming, and they wouldn't stop. And I finally had an explanation for all of the depression and anxiety, the difficulties that I'd had my whole life, which other people hadn't visibly to me been struggling with. And I believe, this is this other state that I described of head down, just get it done, numb, not in the body. This is a trauma response. So, I mean, if we think about the state of our colonial patriarchal society, this to me is a trauma response that, if we go back to Europe 500 years ago, it was just constant war, and it had been for generations. And then from that grew this flee response where, we have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so this flight out of Europe and into the Americas, it was a trauma response. And we can't create anything beautiful and good and true if we're not fully present while we're doing it. And so that's how we ended up with this system. And so I saw that as I was seeing my own trauma responses, as I was learning to make peace with my own body, I thought, well, probably this is what humanity needs to do to make peace with its planetary body. That if I've been in addiction, if I have been trying to run from my own pain and my own trauma because I can't cope with it, probably humanity is doing the same thing, running from its planetary body because it can't cope. And there's the addiction of consumerism, there's the addiction of fossil fuels, there's the addiction of hyperproductivity where people will literally work themselves to death. We've created a system that rewards that. And So ensoulment for me is this offering of bringing each individual back into contact with their soul and learning to have a conversation with the soul so that we can be guided by this source of deep wisdom and incredible power, which is truly regenerative. That, when we're connected with this spiritual dimension of ourselves, we have limitless resource. I mean, we're capable of just extraordinary things. And you
Yeah.
mentioned the whole self, and that for me is what ensoulment is really about, and reconnecting, being able to slow down, because the soul grounds us into the body, and the body is often going to tell us, just slow down, go at the pace of nature, this geological scale where we're really taking our time. That's the kind of world I'd like to cultivate, sort of one person at a time for the moment.
So much. Yes, because, and yeah, like the interesting thing to me was this idea when Amanda Joy Ravenhill was reading about how Buckminster Fuller was about to drown himself in the Great Lakes. And he was really at this place where his life wasn't successful. And he had this awareness where suddenly he realized, oh, like I belong to the universe. And that was his transformation that was able to open him up to be this vessel for all these ideas. And then he said, what can I do in one lifetime? And then he just opened up the potential that was available. And I feel like so many of us have been clamped, in this trauma response where there's a like limit or a glass ceiling on what we're individually capable of and therefore collectively capable of because of that smallness that is, from that space of wounding. And so to do the inner healing work is to acknowledge that there is more that you're here to do, and that as you like free yourself, it's not to like become this, person who's just self-interested. It's actually a way to open up your impact in your community and in your own circles to have those ripple effects. In other words, I always like to give the example of when I'm in my joy, I smile at the person checking me out at the grocery store, like, doing the cash register. And that smile has the potential to ripple out into their day, which then has the potential to ripple out into every other person they meet throughout the rest of the day. They have a good shift. They smile, they ask people questions. Suddenly there's just that little bit is spreading good into the world. And that started with someone who was able to align themselves and orient themselves with joy. And we all have the potential to do that in the littlest ways and in the biggest ways. Sometimes it's the little way in the biggest place at the right time that becomes this, huge movement. Or, sometimes it's just, like you said, showing up and slowing down enough to the rhythms of nature so that we're not looking past our own bodies, our own humanity, or the squirrel crossing the street when we're driving, that we don't run over because we're conscious and we're paying attention, right? Like those things, they echo out. And so, for the practically minded out there, this inner consciousness work is extremely practical to the idea of regenerating or healing the world, and to create a world that like automatically, without our direct willful like design, will start to benefit. And it's about it's about the interweb, it's the interbeing, it's the interconnections of how those ripple out, and how those start to as the health returns to the ecosystem of our culture, to begin to have this foundation of that healthy ecosystem, that healthy social systems that are going to undergird and create a new group of people who are thinking about the kinds of enterprises and building that we want to do, the kinds of cities that we want to build. What is the qualitative aspect of how that feels, and how it interconnects with nature, and how we observe our impact on each other, and how we embody and enjoy and dance and sing and play and become inhabitants of a beautiful life. And I think it's so important.
Hmm. I couldn't agree more. I feel like you just said all of it perfectly. I'll just amplify, use the word smallness. And I think that's really the key here, because there's a part of us that is very small, and we call it our inner child in psychology. And this piece of us gets created from all the vulnerable moments and all of the times when we just couldn't cope. And the inner child is this representation of also our joy and our creativity and our spiritual abundance. And so it's amazing how the most vulnerable part of us is actually our connection to all that is. And creativity is this beautiful thing that we all have. Everybody is creative. Maybe some of our listeners feel like, "Oh, I'm not creative. I'm not an artist." Well, everybody is creative, and we all
Spoiler
have
alert, you're creative too.
surprise. Um, we all have this capacity to draw upon this just mystical well of creative energy. Like, we can create things. I'm creating things as I speak. And these sentences, where are they coming from? And that mysticism, I think, is what sets Buckminster Fuller's work apart. Because that quote that you mentioned, that was one of the defining quotes of my life, actually. When I
No
found
way.
that quote, "You don't belong to yourself, you belong to the universe," it changed everything for me. I was like, yes, he's right. I have no excuse, because the inner child wants to stay small. It's safe to hide. It's safer to not be heard. To
Hmm.
use our voice and to put our visions out into the world, that's dangerous. It could be. I mean, somebody might attack us. I mean, John Lennon, where did he go? These visionaries
Right.
um, a- attract some kind of attention. And we have to remind ourselves that the system profits on our smallness, because we take up less space, we take up less resources, and we're easier to control and manipulate. And
Yeah.
because we live within a hegemony, that's the word for power structures, that comes from Greece 7,000 years ago, when they invented the nation state. Before that, people were just in tribes and they were doing their self-governing kind of situations. But then we became indoctrinated to this idea that somebody else is an authority. Somebody else knows how I should live, and I should follow their rules and their suggestions because they know better. But with ensoulment, what we do is we learn to return to our self authority, and we come back into our own power, which nobody can take from us. We just willingly give it away when we submit to following the path that's been set out for us. Or and that could be an emotional path. Maybe somebody taught us that we're grumpy and we're frowny, and we don't smile at strangers, and we don't have nice things to say. But we could choose a different path, and I believe that the universe has that intention for us in our lives. And if we're going to reconnect, we need to stop being small, because when we are small, we isolate. And I am doing it with my shoulders, right? I'm like hunching in and curling up. And reconnection is open. It's coming out, and we're only able to do that when we feel safe. And so
Yeah.
that's the work of the inner child healing, is to create the sense of safety within ourselves. And if we and I'll tie this back for our practical folks to the reality of systems change and the infrastructure. And the architect in me really values this, is that if we're staying stuck and small, and we're afraid and we're isolating, then we're going to create more focus on war, on scavenging and hoarding resources, and
On
not
separateness.
our separateness. Exactly, that wound of separation, instead of connection, instead of what we realized during the pandemic, which is we need to show up for our neighbors. I need to
Yeah.
know, like, how my neighbors doing, so I can give them my extra resources and create mutual aid networks. So
Yeah.
there's that that opportunity for us now.
Yeah, so much. And it's interesting how in staying small, like there's been this idea that's been put out, like of, humility in smallness. And you really see how that falls apart when you realize that in order to be who you were meant to be in the world, you must be confident. You must embrace your gifts. You must be able to share and be able to initiate. And I love that example of, sharing with your neighbor. I also think that something else you said about how we have to navigate in this world where we're trying to find out how to move against the grain. I feel like that is the realm of the artist. I know so many artists who it's like, we can't go with the grain. It's like physically impossible. It pains us to go with the grain. And so I think that's why the arts are so important, because the artists are the ones saying, hey, the system is broken. Hey, this doesn't work. There's got to be something new. And they're calling forth a new thing. So I want to ask you about visioning. And I want to tie that into the Design Science Studio and ask you about that as well. So first of all, we understand that it's important where we set our sights, what stories we tell ourselves, because those are the things we tend to believe. But, can you tell me a little bit about your life as an artist and maybe your experience of, obviously this also goes into the conversation of having to create a safe space, because ultimately to create the art and put it out, you have to be vulnerable with that inner child to play, create, blah, blah, blah. And that, oh gosh, the world needs to see it. And it's like, wait, I'm not sure I'm ready for someone to critique me. But that is why I think the artists have an advantage here, because we all have been going through that soul process of learning how to let our creations out, even though there's this world out there that doesn't run in the way that we prefer. And we almost can't not do that. And so, yeah, tell me a little bit more about the artistic process in vision, and then let me know what it's like being in the Design Science Studio.
Yes. Well, I think the process of creativity and visioning for me is very well described by that Buckminster Fuller quote that you belong to the universe. And the process of ensoulment has been, it's a process, right? It doesn't end, and I'm still on my ensoulment journey. Um, but what happens is little by little you learn to let go of control and to step out of the way. So you
Mm,
become able to be fully present in the here and now, and you empty yourself through that presence. And then in the space that's created through the emptying comes something. It seems to come from nowhere, but in ensoulment, we know that it's coming from the soul. It's this, this channeling that happens, and then one is moved to write, to paint, to dance, to design, and or even just to be, because I believe being is a beautiful art as well.
yes.
And so it's about uh you know in my architecture practice, when I built a sacred space here where I am in Costa Rica, and I offer thanks to the Wetar people, who are the ancestral stewards of these lands.
Mm,
Um, I Whenever I'm creating a project, and this one in particular, I go there to listen to the land. I'm listening first and foremost, because I know that it's not me who's creating the structure. It's the land creating something through me.
mm,
And so I receive the visions. I don't make them. I'm not the creator of the vision. It is using me to express in the world, is how I choose to see it. Because I feel that helps a lot with the ego side of things, which is the part of us that's quite hurt by the criticism. And, so it's a little self serving, but it's also a more joyous creative process in that way.
yeah.
And so the vision comes alive through me. I give my hands and my blood and my bones to it, and use my human brain, which has left and right and 3D functioning, and I can put pieces together. And now there's a structure that exists on the land. Stained glass windows and a beautiful bamboo reciprocal roof, and uh, a little round hobbit door, and it's a space where people can go and receive nature. They go to be in that space and it changes them. And so I believe that Picasso said that art washes away the dust of ordinary life.
Mm.
And you named this too. It's this, if it moves you, it's art. If it makes you want to do something, even if that's like destroy something or,
Yeah.
maybe it's to create something, whatever it is, there is this movement and transformation that happens. And I'm partial to space as a medium because I'm an architect, and I find light and space to be so transformational. And in in my practice, I mean, it's been very solitary because firstly, I'm a woman, if you haven't noticed, and only about 10 or 15% of architects are women. It is a
Mm.
largely masculine profession.
Yeah.
Um, which is worth noting because if we think about the way that our physical world and our built environment has literally been designed by men,
Yeah.
we start to wonder, is that influencing how we think and feel and act? Like, are we behaving
Yeah.
in a way that is somewhat masculine because our buildings and cities and spaces have been designed by men?
Oh
I don't know.
yeah, 100%.
Good question.
Yeah, 100%. And not
So
to say
far.
there's not a space for the masculine, but there is a need for balance.
Right.
And to acknowledge that our built environments and our art and what we consume and listen to and watch affects what side of the brain is getting priority, and whether the creators are getting validated and valued in our society, or whether it's all about the numbers and the math. I mean, out of balance, it doesn't work. It's not an ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I share that only to elucidate the aloneness that I felt as a visionary
Yeah.
architect. And I was moving through the world and speaking about sacred architecture and sacred geometry and crystalline frequencies, and bringing my training as a mystic into my training as an architect and my practice, and
Hmm.
weaving the two together. And it wasn't until I found the Design Science Studio that I realized I wasn't crazy, that this was something that people really wanted to talk about and hear about.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we can create something that moves people requires people. And what's always, I think, challenged me the most about being an artist is the showing part. And you named that, which I love, is, you can be creative, but until you're showing your work, you're not really an artist.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard. I remember when I finished the building here, the temple, it's named Gayatika. When Gayatika was finished, it was beautiful. The tree that we centered the whole space around and facing. I had joked, wouldn't it be wonderful if this tree blossomed? It has pink blooms. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it blossomed when we finished the building? And then, 6 months or whatever later, 3 days before the inauguration ceremony, this tree burst into glorious fluorescence.
Wow. Right on cue. I was listening.
It was a sign from nature saying, "Thank you, congratulations, you did it." And we had built that space with the permission of the indigenous ancestors of that land. We had gone to the indigenous reserve nearby and asked for their permission, and they had come to help instruct us in the ceremonial creation of this space as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Design Science Studio, I found people that understood the importance of this indigenous connection, this internal connection as well, because I wasn't just making a space that was organic architecture with feminine forms because I like it. It
Yeah.
was a psychological experience. It's
Mm.
something that I call a sensorium, where we're reawakening the senses and bringing people back into their bodies, because the space is curved and it has colorful stained glass windows and it's largely open air.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these things, the healing component of the regenerative development that I had been studying was inherently woven into the work in the Design Science Studio. So
Wow.
the
Yeah.
the holism of the practices of the people around me was really nourishing, and it helped me to to really take my work to the next level in a way that I don't believe anything else could have.
Yeah, and that space and the holistic viewpoint of everybody in the group help you to actually embody that for yourself, which is what you were looking for. I find that often when I work with other healers, it will help me to round my own healing ability within myself. And so that somebody else is holding a space for the possible, what is possible and realistic. Like, this is a thing that we do. We don't just believe it, but we're here in this, whole systems view of life and creating art in that way. Suddenly it frees you up to be that as well. And I feel like there's a big part to the regenerative work that we're doing is just way showing. It's like, hey, look,
Mhm.
here's a thing that can be done that we're doing. And so it exists. And art can do that as well. Art can also foretell that as well. Here's a thing that society we could imagine, and we'd like to build this. And here's a story of what this is like, and how it feels, and isn't this great? And I think that's so important because people resonate with the things that are right for them. So as they come in contact with a story, like let's say Harry Potter or something like that, where they're like, oh, like there's something about this story that just lights me up, that's important because there's something in that for that person that awakens something within them that is, magical or imaginative or free spirited. It gives us permission in a sense,
Mhm.
to be who we are. And I think so much of our modern society doesn't give us permission to be who we are. There's so much that we have to like put on a front of like, here's who I have to be professional. Here's who I have to be a good dad. Here's who I have to be a good partner, et cetera, et cetera. Et cetera. Here's where I need to shop. Here's what I need to wear to be socially acceptable, like those kind of things that really, it's not that those externalities are bad, but it's when we're being false selves. We're not being true self. So being in a group of people like you found at Design Science Studio, where you're with other people who are emanating their true selves, it gives you the template to open and the safety and the like know-how to just like go, oh yeah, I'm a bird, I can fly too, here are my wings. It's like if it's like, what's that quote, if you tell a fish that it should climb a tree, it's going to spend its whole life thinking it's dumb, right? Like if you're a bird and you can fly, but all the other birds they don't fly, it might not occur to you that these wings are for something good, that's
Mhm.
powerful. So
Mhm.
yeah, and I honor your story about what a beautiful example of your architecture, and I feel like the tree is so central to how we need to think about our built systems in the future. Is this partnership and this collaboration with nature that also is a partnership and collaboration with the felt space of the environment? What does this create? Does this, like you said, the space is a healing space. So the spaces in of themselves help the people who come in them to like feel safe, to open, to connect with the divine, if you were, or connect with nature. And these sacred spaces are so important and have been for such a long time. And so much of our modern built environment is not that. It's utilitarian. It's price per square foot. It's ignoring the nature outside. Carl Welty and I talked about that at length in his episode. And it's, I think, to know that that's what things ought to be gives you and others the ability to say, well, that I want that. And for you to make that and somebody can go experience that, I think helps to, and even if somebody were painting that, like, gives other people the ability to like, well, why can't our lived environment look like this painting? Like it should, like this is feels better. And there's, we know what feels good, we know what, and I want to bring it back to this idea of embodiment, because in this conversation, we know what feels good. And, if we had a check-in moment about, when that fear comes up around criticism and art, like there's a feeling that's I can feel in my body as you're talking about that, hey, my shoulders are hunching, like this is scary. There's a feeling within me of like maybe even just to pause and to acknowledge that collective feeling for a moment and say like, okay, what do I do if suddenly in my body I'm feeling this contraction around, oh my gosh, like being seen.
Mm-hmm.
Like what would I do? How do you, when you notice that like contraction, how do you find the open heart again and find the space to breathe and relax? Can you walk me through that practice?
Absolutely. That's such an important question. It is a practice. My teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, he's a Zen Buddhist, a Zen master, um, teaches about the importance of stopping. And so it's important that we acknowledge that when we're in a state of contraction and a traumatic response, we can't really practice anything that's not a habit
Right.
because our prefrontal cortex is turned off
Hmm.
and it's the amygdala and it's the survival brain that's driving the bus. So we really want to look for moments of serenity where we can practice stopping, we can practice the pause. And what that looks like is stop. You ask yourself, what am I doing? What am I doing right now?
I'm having a
Am I
podcast.
thinking? I'm having a podcast. I'm having a conversation. I'm looking at the camera and I'm looking at the screen. So for me, if I were starting to feel that way, I might look away and find something green and distant that I can connect with.
Hmm.
And then automatically we breathe deeper. You just sighed. That's the perfect response. That's what our bodies do. They just naturally let go because they realize they're safe.
Yeah.
And that's the practice. And I mean, in a moment of stress, I would talk to my inner child. I would say, nobody's judging you. Nobody
Mhm.
expects anything of you. You don't have to be doing anything right now. You're safe. I got you. I have a practice of self parenting where my inner child doesn't have to do the adulting. She gets to just be a child. So I let her know, if she's like, "Oh, I'm scared. I don't want to go to that meeting. It's just terrifying." And I'd be like, "Okay, you don't have to come. You stay here and play. I'll be back in an hour." So,
Amazing.
that's an intervention that we can use in a moment where we really are in a crisis.
Yeah.
It's a form of affirmation where we're talking to ourselves in a way that's loving and gentle and kind and humorous and respectful. And at the beginning of our conversation, we touched on how we don't all have great examples to draw upon of how to be our whole selves and to move through the world nonviolently, and in a way that's respectful. And so there's a process that we do as part of ensoulment where we deprogram that conditioning where we're driving ourselves like slave drivers. We're
Yeah.
judging ourselves like malevolent, harsh critics, and we really go through. We have to take steps. We have to actively work to deprogram those things. And a lot of times when we're feeling contracted and we're in that space of, "Well, I don't want to share," that's the time to really parent ourselves the way that a good enough parent would do.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and to acknowledge that there are times within groups, is say you're working in a group of 4 or 5, and there is that tension that enters the room, and oftentimes there's two responses for the group. There's one is, the people who shrink into the corner, kind of fade in the background, and don't say what they need to say, and then there's always the alpha who's like, oh, there's tension, so I'm going to get more loud and more dominant, and that doesn't always have to be the males in the room. It just happens to be a kind of male trait. And so I think in this process of learning how to do leadership through synarchy, it's important for us to take those moments within ourselves to pause. And I think eventually to work in a practice within groups where we're able to, acknowledge our need to go to the bathroom collectively, or acknowledge that we're moving past lunch and we're hungry, and acknowledge that that has an effect on how people act and treat each other and respond and get reactive or whatever. And I think that's one of the challenges with our 24/7 global economy is that, time. It's like, well, we're on the East Coast and we need you to meet at 7 a.m. And so if you're not a 7 a.m. person, suddenly you got to like get on, at that time of day. And that is affecting the dynamic of our groups and our decision making. And so not that we can't do that, but I think it requires even more presence. And perhaps in some of these more intentional group settings, if we could design in some sort of like routines and practices or best practices that just have a regular, like you said, like a habit where you create a positive habit of a check-in with the group, of like a touch point of like, hey, real quick, like how, just stop the conversation. How's everybody feeling in their body right now? Like, I mean, I think it varies from group to group. Obviously, you're not going to do that in a corporate boardroom, or maybe you are. Like, I mean, I almost feel like, these are the kinds of things that would be of benefit. And I love that you mentioned the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. That comes up a lot in my conversations. And what a wonderful community, what a wonderful teacher. And, to walk with presence through the world and even the smallest things that you do, just walking down the street to walk with presence, just having a conversation to have a conversation with presence. And that's presence for you, Veronica, in this conversation. That's presence for me, Stephen, who's in my body speaking right now. And that's presence for all of you who are listening, and also for the trees that are outside, and also for this chair that is supporting me. And it's funny, just like, you don't have to think about it too hard, but when you practice this, it just becomes second nature. You kind of get a little bit more comfortable with like, who am I being in this moment, and how do I be? Like, I don't have, like you said, like, I don't have to, I just get to be here. And then the enjoyment can kick in. It's like, I'm having this beautiful conversation with you, and we've been looking forward to speaking for a long time. And I guess that's maybe where I will shift the conversation for a minute. Like, before we close, where, like, we've interacted indirectly, I think, and, we've heard a lot about each other. So like, I just like 3 minutes to share and ask questions and be curious. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh, that's fun. Do you see a connection between time and colonialism and white supremacy? Because there's like this thread that I feel wanting to come forward, and I'm curious if you want to explore it with me.
Wow. Okay. So Stephen Bao started the mission that I would have done, which was around a circular calendar. And I had said for 3 space camps, if I was going to start a mission, it would be like to do this idea. Well, then he made it, like, and so I think the idea of a society, conforming us to this idea of productivity, a train schedule, a time zone, meeting lasting a certain amount of time, and the calendar month being when the rent's due. Like you mentioned, these systems of hegemony, it's literally like, so I got to pay my landlord or my bank by the 1st. Therefore, I cannot afford to take a moment to myself, to honor myself if I'm tired. I have to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs instead of just one. I have to send my kids to daycare because, that time is money. I feel like for me, that's the system of control at its, first and foremost. I mean, where is the Greenwich Mean Time? It's in London, which was the center of empire. So, and, for all those that are, anti-woke out there, whatever. Okay, the British were bastards. They were not nice people. Just ask any historian. And I think that's, why, like you mentioned, that's why we all sailed the ocean blue and got across to another place. And, like you said, fled the wars in Europe and all those things because it was oppressive. And then what happens? We create the same thing here inadvertently. And, the ideals are there in terms of like being, free, humanity being these humanitarian values, but they're imperfect and they're in process. And so I think as we go back to understanding that it doesn't matter how hard we work, if we're raising a generation that doesn't have parents, and that we're giving them a world that isn't going to be breathable. The water's not going to be drinkable. I think burnout, constant productivity, around the clock, it's ignoring not just our biological needs, but also our holistic thriving. And so, not to say, I have had in-depth conversations with Scott Thrift on my other podcast, The Language of Creativity. And what I like about the work of Scott Thrift is he was in filmmaking, and he filmed the TED stage, and he did documentaries and things like this. He interviewed Brian Eno, and through his interview with Brian Eno, he developed this idea of what if we could develop a longer now? And he's like, we need a technology for that. So he literally designed a clock that's an annual clock, and it starts at the noon position, and it takes one whole year to go around. And you can't see it moving, but you can notice, if you look at it 2 weeks later, you notice that the colors change, because the entire clock is the color wheel, with the seasons being gradients. So there's no lines on this clock. There's no markers. It just is the color wheel. And so spring is green, and summer is yellow, and red is fall, and then it goes into winter, and it's magical. This whole idea, he's sharing with me these experiences people are having with this clock, of just sort of regaining this sense of not just perspective, but that slower, like you said, geological view of time. It suddenly gives us a different viewpoint which to frame our own importance, and how big a deal the deadline from today is really in the grand scheme of things. Often you look at the stars and you're just like, man, my problems are really insignificant, right? So I'm very passionate about this idea. It kind of goes along with for me, the talk that was given about rewilding in one of the space camps, of this idea of listening to nature, and what do the plants need? What are they asking me to do? And understanding, if you're a farmer, there's a whole view of nature, around the seasons and the moons and the cycles, and you can predict when these crop cycles are happening, and they're kind of in this gradient. The weather changes, but there's this slower rhythm that it's suddenly okay, it's almost time, it's time, and then you're just in that moment, and then okay, that time is changing, and we're moving on to the thing. So it's a lot more like keeping time with the moon, because the moon is not just okay, it's it's half, okay, it's quarter, okay, it's full, okay, it's no, it's this slow movement throughout the month. And I think when you reacclimate yourself to that sense of a more natural sense of time, we realize how many of these rhythms and cycles are built into our world, are built into our natural sense of humanity and nature, and the animals, and how those things, and how artificial the calendar is, how artificial our deadlines are, how oftentimes these things are manufactured to create scarcity and to motivate people like carrots and sticks. And that, to me, is the colonialism. And if you want to mention white supremacy, I think it's the idea that that I resonate with, is that it hurts everybody. It hurts the white people too. We just don't understand that, because it's like you ask anybody that's oppressed, and they're like, I'm feeling oppressed. And I think too that we got to acknowledge what we're getting out of it. And I think a big part of talking about productivity culture is there's a part of us that is getting validation out of the idea that I am productive, and that I am #winning. And so, to sort of judo flip that, you have to acknowledge that yes, there are those things and I can do them, but also I am beyond those things. I get to exist just because I am, and I get to be, and I also get to value the people who are in my world that aren't hashtag winning. It's like we all know that. We all know how to have compassion for one another, but it's easy to forget when how easy is it to be driving down the road and just like cut someone off because, we're in a hurry and we realize that, we would have been fine either way. Like, but there's this idea, oh, I'm late. I'm late. And what does that do to our awareness? How does that subtract from us just the experiential joy of life? I mean, 9 out of 10 times, it really doesn't matter how fast we get there or if we're 3 minutes late to something. I mean, yeah, there's the perception of like social graces and, you're keeping me waiting, whatever. If that's not your intent, all it's doing is robbing us of our now. And so I think, that's a perfect example of something that's gotten wildly out of balance, maybe something that has its use. And, we were able to coordinate this meeting because we agreed that noon Pacific was the time and we both showed up, and that's very helpful. You weren't kept waiting for 2 hours because, I forgot. And, so there is, and, that's where I resonate with the work of Buckminster Fuller is you don't get rid of the existing systems by like fighting them. You make a new system that renders the old one obsolete. And so for me, it's very much about, this idea of not fighting, like the oppression, not fight. Yes, there is a place for that, but also like, I'm not going to go like, I'm throwing my watch out the window. Oh, I don't wear a watch, but I'm throwing time out the window. I'm just not, I mean, I think we have to do certain things in our modern life to make it work, but we can still look for practices and ways to re-embody and to reconnect to the cycles of nature and to not always, to sort of like, one step removed, disengage from that artificiality of deadlines and time and the calendar and the clock in any way that we can, so that maybe someday Stephen's calendar maybe will be a thing that people follow, or Scott Thrift's clock will be a thing that people also keep in their homes and have this other sense of time. I think, that's a long answer to your short question, but that was quite the question.
It was loaded. Yeah. Big question. Yeah, you got me thinking about it from the comments that you made about external validation and giving ourselves permission to show up as creatives and getting rid of this false self. And I see in my own life that comes from a relationship to white supremacy, which has indoctrinated me into perfectionism, where I just need to be perfect all the time in order to be worthy of my privilege and to show up as part of the strata that society has placed me within. So I think that you're right, liberating ourselves, rewilding ourselves out of this productivity culture is the work of our times. And that idea of checking in with our bodies and seeing where we're at, that's something that we've done really well in DSS, that we always start our meetings with questions. We start with curiosity and the whole group gets to feed in, and then we dance, we have a wiggle, and then we breathe. And that 3-part ritual has gone a long way to create a sense of culture within our group of now nearly 300 revolutionaries. And I would like to imagine what kind of ripple that will have in the world as well.
Yes, beautiful. I'll ask you a question. What is your hope for the future in the next 3 or 4 years? How do you envision us taking the steps we need to reach a tipping point of a regenerative lens?
I believe that people will experience their inner world with more allowance and acceptance. I vision a world where we're open to grieving. We allow our suffering to show, and we don't need to be perfect all the time. And we can be honest with one another that we're having mental health issues and that our spiritual lives are weak, and we want to be better in those ways, and including emotional literacy. And we can start to have a global conversation about how the biggest disability of our time is depression.
Mm,
And we can destigmatize the inner world, our experience
yeah.
of our emotions, and we can have a global conversation about that. And in that way, we will liberate the creative energy and potential that we have as a species to really evolve beyond these consumerist systems, which are degenerative and
Yeah.
oppressive. And we can start to open our hearts to one another, and to see the suffering of Africa, for example, and to really awaken to the massive conflict that's happening around the world and for the majority of people,
Hmm.
and start to activate our empathy and our compassion, and use that as the force which will motivate us towards our goals for bringing our planetary systems back within boundaries by 2030. So I hope that, in 3 or 4 years, we'll be on the way to accessing the energy that is here for us. The compost heap will be ripening, and
Mm.
we can start to really plant those seeds and cultivate that freedom and abundance that we all deserve.
I love that idea. Like, art activates empathy.
Yes.
And I feel like that's the idea of being the revolutionary artists of this, evolutionary artists of this time. And
Mhm.
yeah, so wonderful to share with you, Veronica. Veronica Anderson, I believe your website is it veronica.earth?
That's it. Yep. You can also find me on Instagram at vero.earth or Visionary Arch.
Amazing. And we'll place some links in the show note to some of the things that you mentioned. Hopefully, if you have pictures of your building that you designed in Costa Rica, it'd be wonderful to link to that. My podcast is the Spaceship Earth Mission Log, which you're watching. It's here on YouTube. It's also on Substack. It's on Apple Podcasts. And my other podcast is The Language of Creativity, and you can easily find that at thelanguageofcreativity.com. I'm Stephen Levitt. It's been an honor to share with you, and please continue to join us, subscribe, review the podcast if you like. And most importantly, I would say check in with your body. How you doing? Go outside and have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, listeners.